It's a pleasure now to welcome our speaker for this evening, Alessio Assonitis, who joins us from the Medici Archive Project, where he began his work in 2004, thanks to a fellowship of the National Endowment of the Humanities, moving very quickly to become director of that program in 2009, where he has been working to not only provide opportunities for postgraduate scholarship, accessing the archival materials of the Florentine State Archive, but also digitizing those materials for scholars outside of Italy. He's here today to talk about the penultimate Grand Duke, Cosimo III. Please join me in welcoming Alessio Assonitis.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Simon, if you're not here. Thank you, Sara, in the other room. A premise, I'm not an expert on Cosimo III. I work on Cosimo I. And I've been, publishing for many years on Cosimo I. Cosimo III is sort of something that we're doing that I had to do in many ways because he is very much related to Jewish culture in Florence. And I'll get to that towards the end. But it's because of the work that we've been doing with the Florentine ghetto that was founded by Cosimo I, but then enlarged by Cosimo III, that all of a sudden I had to sort of, get entangled in the 17th century, in the late 17th century, a place where you somehow never find a way back in many ways. So Cosimo III. I like to show you these two images, and these two images will be shown sort of recurrently throughout the conference, throughout the lecture. And you have a drawing of Cosimo III on a horse, and of course you can see another one, a painting, dressed in ecclesiastical clothes. And I do this because by studying Cosimo III and studying his documents, we can sort of detect, two almost opposite personalities, or almost opposite attitudes. Almost contradictory attitudes. And these contradictory attitudes, and I want to be very symbolic. I'm not going to be I'm not going to be a historian, but much more someone who wants to see things where they're not, will reflect strongly on the Tuscan state and, and the fate of the Tuscan state. And we'll get to that in a second. In the first image, we see the young prince. He's not yet Grand Duke, dressed in elegant clothes, riding a horse. This was a preparatory drawing for a painting which is mentioned in the Medici inventories, but it's now lost. We don't have it anymore. Obviously, I don't want to stress the obvious similarities with the other Grand Dukes, Dukes and Grand Dukes on a horse, Cosimo I and Ferdinando, sort of embodying the sort of political and military power. But with this work, with this drawing, which is in a private collection, my intention really is to point out Cosimo's leisure and mobility, even though maybe the horse is with one foot up, which is probably doing the dressage thing, whatever it's called. And also by the fact that he's sort of distracted by something and almost curious about something which is happening at his side. In this image instead, which was executed more than 40 years later, when Cosimo was indeed Grand Duke of Tuscany, he is depicted in ecclesiastical clothes, and one can even glimpse the Dome of St. Peter in the background, right? And in another version, a copy of this, in this picture, he seems to have put aside the Grand Ducal crown in favor of the biretta, which he's sort of proudly holding, with his right hand. Remember these, use these sort of dichotomy, think about it all throughout this lecture. Cosimo III was born in 1642, and he grew up in a very dysfunctional family. And growing up at the Medici court was not always dysfunctional, and as we'll discover next year or this year with the celebrations for Eleonora di Toledo, which are with a big exhibition which is happening at the end of this year. His father Ferdinand was a student of Galileo and was an avid amateur scientist and collected a great number of technical instruments, of barometers, of thermometers, of telescopes, all of those instruments that we see at the Museo Galileo, and we had no idea what they're for. But he was a great collector of this stuff, and he shared his passion, of course, with his brother, Cardinal Leopoldo, right? Who and the two of them later founded the Accademia del Cimento, and also they really pretty much put together what is then the Biblioteca Palatina, right, at Palazzo Pitti, which really constitutes the core of the collection of the Biblioteca Nazionale di Firenze. Cosimo's mother, on the other hand, Vittoria della Rovere, was a profoundly religious woman, and she made sure that Cosimo and his brother Francesco Maria received a strict pious education. I mean, archival sources describe her as extremely austere, especially when manifesting her religiosity or faith in public. But Vittoria was also someone who indulged in courtly pleasures. For quite some time, she has been sort of dismissed as a bigot, and in part she was. But in recent years, scholars have been assessing her artistic patronage, and which was sort of noteworthy in many ways, and also her role as diplomatic broker and benefactor. Needless to say, the marriage between Ferdinando II and Vittoria della Rovere was an unhappy one, and the fact that Vittoria della Rovere caught her husband in bed with the Roman Count Bruto della Molara did not make things any better in terms of the relationship with the couple. I mean, the couple was estranged for 15 years before they had another son, Francesco Maria, who became cardinal, as it usually happened with the second son of the Medici children. Cosimo grew up surrounded by priests and his mother. I mean, it must have been a great sort of a very alpha mother and priests. And he spent, much of his summer holidays, much of his time, vacationing, visiting convents and going on pilgrimages in the sort of the Tuscan holy sites. Just look at this picture of Vittoria della Rovere with Cosimo. And you can imagine what kind of references she was trying to make, in terms of the iconography. Sort of a merry-looking woman, child, and everything else. I mean, the idea was right there. I mean, also Cosimo was a sort of awkward, sort of sulky, helpless boy. He was known to collect bizarre animals and deformed plants, something that he liked to do even afterwards. But it was also very common in the 17th century, and it was also sort of, in a sense, evolved into his real scientific interest. His tutor was called Volumnio Bandinelli, and who was known, to form, to fashion, to create popes and cardinals rather than princes and grand dukes. He was hardly into hunting or riding, unlike Cosimo I, of course. And already at 17, he was described by an ambassador as being dominated by melancholy, and never, ever laughing. No one has ever saw him laughing ever. So Cosimo's life would radically change, and not for the better, with the arrival of his new wife, Marguerite Louis d'Orléans. This was, of course, an arranged marriage. Marguerite Louise was the cousin of King Louis XIV and granddaughter of the Maria de Medici, so they were related. They're almost cousins. She arrived in Florence in 1661 after spending time in the exciting courts of Paris and Versailles, filled with balls and dances and music and theater. So if the marriage of Cosimo's parents was horrible, right? His own marriage turned out to be a real nightmare. In fact, you can never find them together, the two of them together. It's very rare to find the couple together unless it's sort of a pastiche. Even during the marriage negotiations, Marguerite wanted nothing to do with the future Grand Duke of Tuscany, since she was initially promised to the Duke of Savoy and was infatuated actually with the Duke of Lorraine, with whom she had a secret affair, which was known throughout the courts. After a triumphal entry into Tuscany, Marguerite soon realized that what a dismal situation she was stuck in. The high-spirited, flamboyant French princess hated Florence, hated the constant presence of priests at court, as well as the rigid customs, and detested her husband and the influence that the mother had on him. Not only did the two never get along, I mean, the two did not get along at all, they literally could not be in the same place or in the same room for more than a few minutes. However, a few minutes were enough time to produce three children, Ferdinando, Anna Maria Luisa, and Gastone, and the last offspring of the Medici dynasty. And we'll get back to that maybe in a second. So Cosimo, again, look at him on a horse. Cosimo needed a break, and we go back to his image. He really needed a break. He couldn't be there anymore as a married prince. His overbearing religious alpha mother, who was still alive, and his rambunctious and flamboyant French wife were way too much for his meek and passive personality. I mean, the only way to escape this deadly grip, really, was to get out. And indeed, he got out as quickly as possible and for a long time. Between his marriage in 1661 and his elevation to the Grand Duchy of Tuscany in 1670, Prince Cosimo embarked on 3 major tours of Italy and Europe. The first in northern Italy, and we have, and then finally the second and the third in Western Europe. All of these, Western and Southern Europe, all of these trips, for all these trips, we have exhaustive records. We have travelogues, letters, drawings, account books. His trips were very well documented, and the archive is filled with information about these journeys. So for the first time in his life, Prince Cosimo was living at large. I mean, spending money and buying art and meeting people, visiting courts, university, cathedrals, printing presses, markets, collections, country villas, and of course, sanctuaries and churches. Cosimo, who was, by the way, Cosimo was fluent in Spanish and French, but he loved England, was curious about the world, and this curiosity about the world would emerge in a different way and in contrast to his religious zeal once he became Grand Duke of Tuscany. During these extended journeys, he found time to attend a performance of Molière's Tartuffe. He made a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. He inspected the port and the industrial plants of Amsterdam and Hamburg. He lost himself in the botanical gardens in Leiden. While at Oxford, he attended lectures on philosophy and mathematics, including a heated debate was organized just for him on Galileo's doctrines. Among his most delightful pastimes was spending time visiting collections, of course, of oddities and curiosities. Now, even when he returned to Florence, he couldn't wait to get out of the Medici court, as when he visited the religious sites in the Casentino with an entourage of 30 people. Even during this brief trip, he was able to connect with the roots of Tuscan spirituality and with the subjects who gifted him every time he stopped at every town, with livestock, with food, with wine. It was sort of Cosimo getting reconnected to his own land. At a certain point, and I'll mention it later, maybe, he goes up in Vallombrosa, and with binoculars, he looks at, Tuscany, almost thinking about what it will be one day that he'll become Grand Duke. So, but this joyride, this fun, so to speak, was soon over. Cosimo became Grand Duke shortly after returning from his second European tour in the late 1670, meaning in 1670. During his absence from Florence, his relationship with his wife worsened. Marguerite would belittle Cosimo in every chance she had in public. When she became Grand Duchess, she laid claim to her portion of power. I mean, she was constantly being reprimanded, by the way, by the Florentine court to such an extent that her relentlessness was made public through a small but very powerful, very incisive pamphlet, which was distributed among the European courts. Despite the intervention of King Louis XIV and of Pope Clement X to try to restore domestic harmony, she returned to France in 1675, where she retired in a monastery. Not true. Only to leave shortly thereafter, in fact, to partake in the exciting life of the Parisian court. The two would never meet again. So it should be said that Cosimo, when he became Grand Duke in 1670, inherited sort of a financially precarious state from his father, Ferdinand II. Florence barely recovered from the devastating plague of 1630 and 1631 that had decimated the population. The Jesuits were gradually taking possession of the offices of the public administration, as well as of this significant acreage of Tuscan territories. The intrusion of ecclesiastical authorities within the urban fabric and within the social fabric reached its apogee with the institution of the Inquisition at Santa Croce. What almost completely drained, however, the Grand Ducal coffers was the wars of Castro. The wars of Castro against the forces of the Barberini Pope, Urban VIII. Ferdinand, his father, bankrolled these military campaigns, accruing gargantuan debts with mercenaries. All this had inevitable domestic repercussions. The naval fleet was gradually being dismantled. The wool and silk industries, once the major industries and major sources of income of the Tuscan state, suffered tremendously. Taxes were being levied, and the cost of maintaining the Grand Ducal court were reduced, of course, because there really was very little money left. So this is what he inherits when he becomes Grand Duke. This period, and historians know this, is sometimes called the general crisis, and again, it was really marked, the period from 1630 to 1670, but also all the way up to the beginning of the 18th century was also marked by an enfilade of devastating plague, the Manzonian plague in 1629, 1633. Recently, John Henderson wrote a book on this very plague, and we're presenting his book in a couple of weeks, I think. The plague of Seville in 1647, the Neapolitan plague of 1656, and of course the Great Plague of London in 65, 66. So this was, again, a period which was already hard in Tuscany, but also hard for many reasons throughout the rest of Europe, right? Also, Cosimo came to power, but also, it's true also of Ferdinand, his father, but especially Cosimo came to power during sort of the crystallization of European nation states and the consolidation of their colonies abroad and their colonial empires. Tuscany, in many ways, was no longer part of this elite group of superpowers, especially since the European arena of profit and conflict was gradually shifting, but inevitably shifting from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. So, and Florence was cut off. Under Ferdinand II, the father of Cosimo, the Grand Duchy of Tuscany kept uninvolved as possible in European political discussions, though it could not avoid financial obligations in support of the allied states. Financial obligations, as I mentioned, that cost Tuscany an arm and a leg, right? But this neutrality or independence, if you want to call it, morphed immediately into anonymity, or at least relegated Tuscany to a more peripheral dimension after centuries, after 1 century at least, of political prominence. So, and this is reflected on the marriages that Cosimo's children were arranged with. Basically, in truth, in the first decade of his rule, and in the which is basically the last quarter of the 17th century, Cosimo had really little to offer to Europe of the upper echelons. Medici offspring, once bargaining chips to be married in exchange for power and cash, really had lost their value. I mean, his 3 children married well, but not great. And most importantly, all 3 children produced no heirs, effectively putting an end to the dynastic line of the Medici. But that, in a sense, was already happening during Cosimo III. That is, the loss of power and the loss of a Medici identity within Tuscan Church, the Tuscan state. Cosimo's miserable marriage with Marguerite Louise d'Orléans certainly did not fortify French-Tuscan relations, especially after Marguerite herself badmouthed her husband nonstop once she returned to Paris. I mean, again, we see this from all different kinds of ambassadorial dispatches, which were always recorded. How much Marguerite was really defaming her husband, her former husband. Nor did Cosimo's fascination with for Britain in any way galvanize the relations between the 2 countries, though Cosimo often employed English intermediaries when engaging with financial and diplomatic affairs, especially with the Ottoman Empire for quite some time. So we have lots of documents, sort of pinpointing this brokerage on the part of the British, part of the English, between Tuscany and the Ottoman Empire, especially in the late 17th century, early 18th century. So Cosimo needed to find solutions to mitigate an unstoppable recession. He turned to his own land to find resources, and think back of when he went to the Casentino and he was looking with the binoculars at sort of the landscape, the Tuscan landscape. He promoted important agrarian reforms, and he grain and grapes were massively cultivated and sold, along with fruits and vegetables, not to speak of plants and flowers. Wine produced in Tuscany, for instance, was widely exported to England, France, and Spain. Not only that, Cosimo implanted a great variety of foreign vines, making many of which were celebrated, of course, in the great poem by Francesco Redi, Bacco in Toscana, and also by Bartolomeo Bimbi in his paintings, which are now at Poggio Caiano in the Museo della Natura Morta. Another area which suffered significantly under Cosimo, and as I mentioned before, and which used to be the flagship of Tuscan economic success, was wool manufacturing. Here too, Cosimo's heavy and unjustified fiscal pressure, together with the booming of foreign wool production, proved to be a great blow to the Tuscan wool industry, which in a way never really was able to come back to be the number one industry as it was in the previous centuries. So cannibalizing Tuscany and perhaps not exploiting, for instance, the full financial commercial expansion of the international port town of Livorno was perhaps the worst possible survival strategy in an ever expanding global economy. It's almost as if Cosimo's emotional narrow-mindedness oozed out onto the public sphere, this great religiosity, and we'll get to that in a second. I mean, his conservative attitudes, born out of his obstinate religiosity, were in many ways imposed on his people. The clergy, as I mentioned, which directly or indirectly gained control of the administration, executed these policies impeccably. The Jesuits became the real menace, though their presence in Florence, by the way, existed, and it dates back to the previous century, especially when Eleonora Toledo came to Tuscany, to Florence. Thanks to Cosimo, but also especially thanks to Cosimo's mother, Vittoria della Rovere, the Jesuits gradually took possession of the offices of the public administration, as well as sort of significant acreage of Tuscan territories. This is very important. They really, in a sense, invaded, the Tuscan, and especially the Florentine urban and administrative fabric. The intrusion of ecclesiastical authorities within the urban and social fabric reached its apogee with the empowerment of the Inquisition, which was located, as I mentioned, in Santa Croce. Cosimo granted this institution clearance to investigate and even incarcerate those suspected of heresy, witchcraft, superstition, apostasy, and sacrilege, without even going through the Grand Ducal administration. So they really were able to bypass that, which wasn't the case before. And this, in a sense, this morality police, especially the Inquisition, had such great powers. And ironically, it's sort of funny, this special privilege backfired when the Inquisition questioned and later condemned a local female mystic that Cosimo was eager to fast track towards sainthood. So, I mean, even in a sense, it really backfired in a sense, because the one thing that the Medici don't have is a saint, and they've been really working hard to make that happen, and it didn't happen. They have everything else, but not a saint. So, so on the whole, Cosimo sought also to centralize the Tuscan judiciary and to place it under his own aegis. So you have the church, the Jesuits on one hand, and Cosimo trying to control the judiciary, and also in an attempt to expedite the legal process, he abolished the former tribunal system that had been in use for centuries, but which maintained a certain and which always maintained a certain independence from the Grand Ducal administration, even under Cosimo I, who was perhaps one of the most authoritarian of the dukes. So these reforms, Cosimo's the third reforms, proved to be ineffective and soon had to be abolished. Rather than streamlining the judicial process, he made it more bureaucratic and in some cases arbitrary and autocratic. Florentine citizens did not respect justice, but feared justice. Under Cosimo's reforms, minor crimes, for instance, like theft or even vagrancy, were now punished with exemplary, humiliating, and utterly disproportionate sentences. So you're beginning to see this construction of this character. Cosimo was really known, even in Europe, as the Rex Sacerdos, so the king priest. And his sort of narrow-minded, narrow political think tank, his limited political think tank that surrounded him, was mostly composed obtuse enablers. So Cosimo manifested his devotion with pilgrimages and processions, by collecting relics, by venerating local saints, by sponsoring missionary campaigns in Protestant territories, by becoming a canon of the Basilica of San Giovanni Laterano in Rome. And by the way, this position allowed him to bless the crowd as if he himself were a pontiff or a pope. So in many ways, he nullified the efforts undertaken by his predecessors, basically by Cosimo I all the way to Ferdinand II, to disentangle the Grand Duchy from church fetters. Well known were his celebrations upon receiving the news in late 1683 that the imperial army had defeated the Ottoman forces in Vienna. While reading his diplomatic correspondence from this period, one gets the feeling that he was pushing, to organize a new crusade. I mean, there's a lot of that in his rhetoric, especially in the letters. Also known are his epistolary exchanges with men and women in odore di santità, in odor of sanctity. Again, the Medici had popes, cardinals, grand dukes, but never a saint. So, and Cosimo also imposed a number of moral bans which impacted the everyday lives of Florentine, such as the frequent suspension of popular festivities, including the Calen Maggio. He banned dancing near churches. Why near churches, I don't know, or dancing on religious holidays, and enforced curfews when things got out of control. Luxury and conspicuous consumption were also persecuted, despite the fact that the costs of his court were exorbitant. He punished cuckoldry, common law marriages, gambling, blasphemy. I mean, this is aside from the Inquisition, aside from the ecclesiastical authorities. Of course, he punished homosexual activity, the very same activity in many ways that his father was very much engaged in. So he was, in a sense, becoming more and more conformist, more and more bigoted. And that's why he's always been known as the bigoted sort of Grand Duke. So he instituted a ban against public affection. Young men and women could not sort of be caught out in public making out, or he condemned prostitution. And when this ban proved ineffective, he made sure that prostitutes pay taxes on their services. His puritanical views prompted him to remove the nude sculptures of Baccio Bandinelli, of Adam and Eve, in the Duomo of Florence. Sculpture, by the way, they were commissioned by his great-grandfather, Cosimo I, the founder of the Grand Duchy. So in many ways, Cosimo III was sort of morphing into the new Fra Girolamo Savonarola, so the anti-Medici Dominican friar, who he is, who wanted sort of to rid Florence of vice in the late 1490s. I actually wrote my dissertation on Savonarola. I should be a little more articulate. And just like Savonarola, he had an axe to grind with Jews. And this we get to. I want to make a little sort of a little digression here, because this is something that almost as a case study. As self-proclaimed custodian of the faith, the Catholic faith, his plan was to convert Tuscan Jews to Catholicism, the same plan that Savonarola had back in the 1490s, right? Needless to say, this effort, was hardly successful, though he did provide a pension and quite a lot of money, actually, for all those who did decide to convert to Catholicism, all those Jews who did decide to convert to Catholicism. However, Cosimo did pass a series of widespread bans that limited their freedom. And here you see, of course, the Bonsignori map with the ghetto right here, where the arrow is. This is a reconstruction of the ghetto that we've been doing at our research institute from original documents. This, of course, was in Piazza della Repubblica. And there is the master plan, and we found all the documents of the ghetto. And basically, each document is, we don't have the sort of the blueprint of the entire ghetto, but we have every individual apartment. So we had to reconstruct like a mosaic, every individual apartment to come up with the sort of the ground plan, and of course the 3D model. So he did pass a lot of bans that limited their freedom. Tuscan Jews could not live under the same roof with Christians. Nor could they live in houses that were connected via passageways, entrances, courtyards, gardens, or terraces with Christians, and vice versa, of course. Jews could be evicted from their homes. Bear in mind that at a certain point, under the Ferdinand I, Cosimo II, Ferdinand II, Jews in Florence, especially wealthy ones, they had to have an apartment in the ghetto, right? But they actually lived outside, especially the wealthy ones. So at a certain point, Cosimo decided that everyone who was the wealthy Jews who were living outside, had to go back inside the ghetto, and that's why he built the new ghetto, which you see right here, to bring back and force the Jews to go back and live in the ghetto in Piazza, which is now Piazza della Repubblica. So Jews could be evicted at any time if necessary, whether they lived in the ghetto or they resided outside. Again, let us not forget that Cosimo enlarged the ghetto in order to forcibly, as I mentioned, repatriate Jews, wealthy Jews, and in a sense, he had to repatriate 450 people wealthy Jews back into the ghetto. Jews could not have sexual relations with Christian prostitutes and vice versa. Christian wet nurses could no longer be allowed to breastfeed Christian Jewish babies. Permission was granted only via a written petition, which was almost always neglected. It was almost always not given. This was especially problematic since the number of births in Jewish communities in Tuscany was increasing, while number of births in the Christian Catholic population was decreasing. Jews could not hire Christian service or employees. Jews were no longer allowed to work in the wool trade, another important thing. So many of these bans also established a reward for secret informers who could provide information about Jews who broke the law. These bans inevitably fomented anti-Jewish sentiment on the part of Christian population to such an extent that new laws had to be introduced to protect Jews from the various forms of harassment and violence caused by the laws of Cosimo. So what I'm trying to convey right now is, in this first part of my talk, is the degree to which this state was becoming more and more static and unable economically, politically, but in a sense also morally, to keep up with the sort of the protean dynamic world outside of Tuscany. So all of a sudden Tuscany became, well, it was always sort of, the cutting edge of many things, all of a sudden was, stopped for some reason. It was no longer that sort of that center for new ideas and culture. It was in a way, but not had as much as other countries, other nations outside of Italy. So, I mean, and from the documents, and by the way, Cosimo III documents, the Medici epistolary collection, the Medici diplomatic archive called the Medici del Principato, is made up of, diplomatic, administrative, and private archive, is made up of 5 to 6 million letters. Of these 6 million letters, at least 1.5, 2 are just about Cosimo III's period, simply because Cosimo ruled for a very long time. He became Duke, Grand Duke in 1570 and died in 1723. So that's the longest reign of all the Grand Dukes. And of course, with time, more letters and more information comes in to Florence, as opposed to the earlier periods, where it was less communication. Still important, but less. So what I was trying to convey exactly is that, that Florence was not keeping up with the protean world around it, with the nation states. And you get a clear perception of this paralysis, of this aridness in the documents. At a certain point, and this is something maybe symbolic, if you want to read it, Cosimo III tries to consolidate everything. That is, he has all the sculptures from Villa Medici in Rome be brought back to Florence. One other thing that he does, which is sort of, again, symbolic in many ways, is that he asks his functionaries to it's a very strange document. He asks his functionaries to note and make record of every single possessions that the Medici had, even back in the Trecento, right? When possessions that were no longer in the Medici sort of and they did not belong to the Medici, like Palazzo Medici, Riccardi, just to get a sense of how much they had, and no longer had. So it's a very strange 1699 document where he basically said, that used to be mine, that used to be mine, that used to be Medici, that used to be Medici. It's a very strange, 3 volumes of basically possessions of real estate and land that the Medici once had and lost. So there is a sense of a melancholy of the end of the Grand Duchy, even before his death, and even before the death of Giangastone. Once Cosimo, I think, also realized that he had no heir, let alone a male heir, from Ferdinando, who of course died prematurely of, I think, syphilis, if I'm not mistaken, and Gian Gastone, he tried to find other solutions. I mean, he needed an heir, he needed a male heir, right? To such an extent that he asked his brother, who was a cardinal, to decardinalize himself and marry a younger woman, and of course they didn't produce anything either. So he also trying to find an escamotage to see whether Anna Maria Luisa's children could be considered as heirs, but she didn't produce children either. So I mean, it was a complete disaster. In any case, at this point, shortly after the turn of the century, in the early 18th century, the European powers were pretty much already trying to figure out who came next. And of course, who came next were the Habsburg-Lorraine. So at the same time, and this is the sort of the schizophrenia of Cosimo III, whenever he was, though not struck actually by that wanderlust, that he had during these early years as a prince, Cosimo always maintained sort of an innate curiosity for animalia, for naturalia, and for artificialia. So for anything that came from, anything exotic, anything came from the world, outside of Italy, outside of Europe. So this is the aspect of Cosimo, which is very complicated. On the one side, he was very conservative and very religious and a bigot, and then the other side, he was extremely sensitive to sort of the new scientific and the new world that was approaching, that it was coming, to Florence. He loved plants. Cosimo was, third was someone who loved, more than any other Grand Duke, he was a great botanist in plants and fruits. And it had always been his pastime, and during the course of his almost, more than half a century rule, he he commissioned, corresponded, and even collaborated with, the cutting edge naturalist, botanist, geologist, agronomist of the time. And here I'm showing you, of course, Niccolò Steno, Francesco Redi, Piero Nati, and Michelangelo Tilli, sort of really the great sort of botanists at the time. During his European tours, right, while still a prince, his curiosity was omnivorous, and however, the two things that attracted him the most were, of course, religious relics and bizarre plants, exotic flowers, deformed fruits. I mean, there's something about that sort of the world of the cabinet of curiosity, mixed with botany that sort of, made him extremely eager to discover, to find out, to collect. When he was, whenever he traveled, whenever he visited European cities, he met with naturalists, with apothecaries, with botanists, again, his curiosity was omnivorous. His horizontal curiosity was omnivorous, while his vertical religiosity was sort of bigoted. He visited gardens, naturalia museums, pharmacies, parks, flower markets, orange and lemon groves. He was someone who could not stop. The letters are very clear about this. Whenever he was away from Florence, he was a different person. In England, for instance, he was mesmerized by the landscape, the country houses, the agricultural land, especially by the way the English, and this is something that is written a lot in his letters, in the letters that were written back to Florence from, by the secretaries who traveled with him to Florence. He was mesmerized by how the English experienced nature, something that was very different from what he was used to back in Florence. In Amsterdam, he purchased books on medical remedies, really a lot of money, a lot of books, and he even bought a still life by Jan Davids de Hem, however you pronounce that. And he would be, because Amsterdam was a hub, was a clearinghouse between East and West, he was sort of purchasing everything that was far away from what he was used to. So in France, for instance, he loved hydraulic marvels of fountains and gardens. He tried to import he tried to bring a lot of these engineers to Florence, but didn't work. Whenever he had a chance, he would climb. I told you this is very important. The idea of climbing on a mountain, anywhere in Europe, and with his binoculars, looking around like a geographer would, understanding the landscape, and with scouting it with the horizon with a telescope. His interest in horticulture was, of course, fomented by his his father Ferdinand, which was not a great, I mean, he was not a great botanist. He was much more of a scientist, technical scientist, someone interested in collecting in scientific instruments. During his childhood, Cosimo's childhood, Florence, really had become, because of Cardinal Leopoldo, his uncle, and because of the Accademia del Cimento, a hub for scientific experimentation. So, which was also became, sort of a place where all different kinds of German, English, and French naturalists would come and work and study in Florence. Once Cosimo became Grand Duke, he sponsored the publication of pharmacological remedies, of scientific treatises, of recipe books, including a new edition of the Ricettario Fiorentino, which was the official pharmacopoeia made to regulate, the production of medicaments by apothecaries in Tuscany, and was continuously updated over the course of the 16th and 17th century, reflecting the changes in medical theory and practice and in scientific discourse. He also would endow lots of university positions at the University of Pisa. So he sponsored, for instance, one thing he did a lot was sponsoring scientific expeditions, which would record and bring back to Florence New World and Asian plants and fruits and seeds, potatoes, pineapple, the ginseng, tomato, which were then planted in the gardens of the University of Pisa, in the Studio di Pisa, right? This passion for plants, fruits, and animals, I should add also, was reflected in the collection of pictorial representations of plants, fruits, and animals. Again, this was not something exclusive to Cosimo III, but a widespread interest among the Medici Grand Dukes, Grand Duchesses, and princes since the 16th century, if not even earlier in many ways. So today, I mean, a significant number of pictures, a significant, we get a sense of Cosimo's interest in fruits by visiting, of course, the Museo della Natura Morta, at Poggio a Caiano, right? In fact, the great bulk of the still lifes in this museum, which comprises something like 400 pictures, was put together in the early 17th century. However, it reached its highest point with Cosimo III and his son, Prince Ferdinand. Now, originally these still lifes were used to decorate the many Medici palaces, villas, and hunting lodges scattered in Tuscany. Cosimo III not only purchased paintings of this genre, not just Italians, but also Dutch and Flemish, but also commissioned them ex novo. So he was a collector and a patron at the same time. The painter, of course, who more than others embodied Cosimo's taste for portraits from nature, was, of course, Bartolomeo Bimbi, whose works, again, feature copiously throughout this museum in Poggio a Caiano. Bimbi was able to integrate Cosimo's interest for scientific inquiry with his love of Baroque still lifes. And they often serve as artistic records of the variety of fruits and plants that were cultivated in the botanical gardens in the Medici villas. Although flowers were a recurring theme in Bimbi's work, his paintings never appear to be repetitive and mechanical. Each possess some kind of spontaneity and freshness, and this is something that Cosimo III writes a lot about. I mean, he's very pleased. It's very little. It's rare to find, such manifestation of pleasure when addressing the work of a painter, especially in Medici documents. So Bimbi produced large-scale canvases documenting the extraordinary variety of fruits that were cultivated in the gardens of the Grand Duke, Villa Topaia, especially, which is near Sesto, while freshly killed game and zoological subjects are displayed in the Villa Ambrosiana, which was more of a hunting lodge. So Cosimo implanted, as I said, a lot of these vines, which are, again, that, as I mentioned before, celebrated by Bimbi, but also by Redi, by the great poem Bacco in Toscana, right? And figs and oranges produced in the villas, would be represented, and they all had a cartouche, right? A sort of, cartouche, almost as if they were scientific illustrations more than pictures, which allow the viewer to identify, the fruit, the specific fruit, the specific kind of fruit that was depicted. Also, there were records of extraordinary deformed, monstrous fruits. And here you have a huge truffle. They were found in Tuscany. So a huge truffle and a very strange cauliflower head. Here you have, almost essentially anthropomorphic turnip, I think, right? Sort of seems to be ready to be, to engage in some kind of activity with the abnormal cauliflower. So, I mean, and you have, of course, the monstrosities, the monstrous sheep and calves, which were born in Tuscany. Interesting, the sheep with two heads, we also have in the form of a document. It's a big sort of record, a large record coming from, I think, from the area, in the around Lucca, where a sheep with two heads was born and was brought to Florence. There's descriptions and scientific inquiries, so on and so on. So it's nice to combine these two things together. And also, there's a cartouche, explaining exactly when and how this happened. Game. Again, remember that Cosimo III always liked to make contact with his own territory. He didn't like Florence, but he liked Tuscany, right? So, the game that was hunted in the vast Tuscan territory, not by Cosimo III because he didn't like hunting them much, but nor his son Ferdinand, who was more into music, by the way, but probably Giangastone was depicted. Giangastone was more into hunting than the other two, so he loved riding and hunting, and this game was, in a sense, depicted and displayed in these hunting lodges, right? And then we get large fish, and the reason why I have a fish here will tie up everything with the very last picture. Huge, abnormal, extraordinarily big fish that were caught in the Tuscan hinterland. Here you have a fish gasping its last breath, right? So again, we have a lot of these depictions of fish here. Again, if you look at the collection of in Poggio a Caiano, you see here, Mediterranean sort of ocean sea fish, and also lake and river fish. They're all very much depicted and represented. Here is another one right here. This is a painter called Giuseppe Ricco, who was a Neapolitan painter from the late 17th century. He's very well known for his depiction of fish. And then we get to this picture right here, John Ostilio. And this ties the entire sort of cycle. It brings back, what I said about Cosimo and the Jews. And this, John Ostilio is a Jewish Baroque painter. He grew up, he was born in the ghetto. He was, was officially listed in the inhabitants of the ghetto. And all of a sudden he becomes, this is what we're working on right now at the Medici Archive Project for the exhibition that will happen, that will take place in 2023 at the Palazzo Pitti, on the works of, of this Jewish painter. And if I ask you how many Jewish Baroque painters, Italian Jewish Baroque painters I expect for you to say, nada, right? So, and we found lots of his pictures, both his still lives and also his landscapes. And this goes back to what I was saying before. I mean, he limited the freedom of Jews in Florence, right? And his predecessor did not. Cosimo I, Ferdinand did not. Opposite. Think of Ferdinand and Livorno and the Livornine, right? And at the same time, he did everything possible to restrict, to limit their freedom. And at the same time, Cosimo III, he commissioned works, but from a Jewish painter, right? Again, these contradictions, this sense of contrasting things. I mean, you have one and you have the other, which again characterizes a lot Cosimo III's career. For someone, I think, who never really wanted to become Duke. I think that is, the issue. He never really wanted to become Grand Duke, And here I finish with the last two pictures, the ones that I started with, the split personality, of someone who, was on the one hand, self-absorbed and had, a sense of personality limits, right? Was completely self-absorbed and was always into some level of involution, right? And on the other hand, you have the prince who is on a horse, who looks away, who thinks of the world which is surrounding him, and these two things is, in a sense, what, in a nutshell, a index of possibilities of Cosimo's career, the third, and life, all the way to the end. And at the end, with no children produced by his children, at that point in 1723, when Giangastone becomes Grand Duke of Florence, the story of the Medici is over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alessio, for coming to give us this wonderful talk on Cosimo III. What we tend to do here on Wednesday nights is share the space with the speaker with both the roomers and the Zoomers, as we've come to call them. So we can see we've got a great turnout online, but before we ask if there are any questions from our online participants, I'm going to walk around here to see if we have any questions first with the microphone in the classroom. Is there anyone here that has a question for Alessio?
Has there been any documentation as to why the Medicis had no children the last, I guess, generation of Medicis?
What do you mean? Why they didn't
Produce any children?
I mean, physically produce any children? I mean, they tried. I mean, you have three. You have two chances. Two males, right?
Right, but was it?
And also, I mean, these two males were very active. I mean, whenever they were in Venice, the two of them were always sort of, especially one of them was extremely active.
Were they sterile? I mean,
Honestly, I really don't know. I couldn't answer this question. No, I mean, I can't think of why. To be honest, one, like to have sex in a way that you don't have children. In many ways, but that was in the case because Ferdinand II, the father of Cosimo III, right, was always caught, with men, sleeping with men, and not always, but sometimes, right? But he did produce children, that was not the issue. The issue was more, I really honestly don't know. It's because it's. And syphilis may be part, but they were married before too. I mean, syphilis, they acquired syphilis, one of them, after he was married. So, but for instance, even the old brother, the cardinal, that was no longer cardinal, he tried and didn't work. So it's a disaster, complete disaster.
Let's see if we have any questions here from anyone on the online group. I saw a hand was raised before. Perhaps Brendan has a question for us. And Mark, I see Mark. I'm going to ask you to be all civilized here and come one at a time. But if you unmute your microphone, we can hear you here in the lecture hall.
sorry.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, hello.
Yes, I'm Sean, Brendan's other half. Thank you very much. That was very enjoyable. Can you say a little bit more about Cosimo III and Chianti Classico and the definition of the area? His interest in wine.
I know, as I said, I'm expert of one, not three. Cosimo first, not three. I know that he created, a kind of a dock area that he actually, that he was at some point delineated a section of the Chianti and in a sense protected it from any kind of I don't know, contamination with other types of grapes. I know that he did that, and that is something that he recurrently enforced. There is even a bando, which is an announcement, a law, that says that that a certain area in the Chianti was to be protected, and it was to be sort of not considered as indigenous, but as Tuscan. He talks about this idea of Etruria a lot, right? So that I know, but aside from that, I don't think. I mean, I can't say more of this.
Okay, thank you.
I think we also saw our colleague Mark Roberts had a question. Mark?
Yes, thank you, Alessio. Wonderful lecture. It seemed to me like a filthy, dirty portrait of Cosimo III that you cleaned beautifully with your archival information. I have one question. Who was the female mystic that you mentioned that Cosimo was fast tracking? And
I'm sorry, Mark, I forget her name. She was someone from the area around Prato, which he was again, he would correspond with her often. I mean, he would try to, to also to promote the sanctity of this woman in many ways. But the very Jesuits who, were there to enforce his uber religiosity, his uber Catholicism, found out she was sort of a scam, at some point, or more importantly, it wasn't instrumental for whatever Jesuit cause or Jesuit agenda that they had.
Right.
But I can give you the name. I forget what her name is. Fra Paola da Ogibonzi, something like that. I don't know.
Thank you.
Do you have any other questions here in the room for Alessio? Any other questions from our participants online this evening? I don't know if that's Victoria raising a hand or if that's a weird cursor here on this computer screen. I don't see anyone coming out of mute, so I'd like to thank you for joining us. And if you have appreciated this talk and would like to support us in the continuation of our cultural mission, you know that we have a Just Giving page and your donations are greatly appreciated and gladly accepted. We hope to see you all next week for the next installment of the Wednesday Cultural Program. For those of you who are here in Florence, if you'd like to have a glass of wine before going back out into the sunshine, we're happy to offer that for you. And for those of you back home, stay safe and well. Thank you so much for joining us.
Ciao.